Enchiladas are definitely among my favorite foods in Mexican cuisine, and I love making them at home because it's not all that hard to end up with absolutely delicious enchiladas. You got your filling, you got your tortillas, and most importantly, your enchilada sauce. And while I think some of the canned enchilada sauce out there is perfectly good and produces a perfectly tasty final product, as I've said a million times, nothing beats homemade, and that is definitely true when it comes to my scratch-made enchilada sauce. Starting with some beautiful dried chilies, we're going to be creating this whole batch of sauce from scratch and then canning it up into some pint mason jars. It might seem like there's a lot that goes into it, but overall, it's really kind of simple. And we're going to go through every single step, including the pressure canning process. So let's do it. Let's start by taking a look at our ingredients. First, we've got our dried chilies. I'm using 3 different kinds, all popular in Mexican cuisine and in making enchilada sauce. For this batch, I'm using 6 Ancho chilies, 6 Guajillo chilies, and 6 Pasilla chilies. If you can't find dried chilies like this at your grocery store, just buy them online. All of these come from a variety pack I bought on Amazon, and I'll put the link to them in the video description. Then, I've got some diced tomatoes. You can use fresh or canned. I'm using canned. Then some whole cloves of garlic, some marjoram, cumin, kosher salt, black pepper, and a little brown sugar. And finally, diced white onion. And as always, check out the video description for this full recipe, including measurements and quantities. The first thing I'm going to do is give all those peppers a quick toast. So I'll heat up my cast iron skillet until it's very hot, and then just throw in the peppers, a few at a time. I'll give them 10 to 15 seconds on each side, and that's it. This will make them more fragrant and flavorful, but any more than 10 to 15 seconds and they will burn, which I definitely don't want. Next, I have to cut each pepper open and remove the seeds. Most of them are loose and will just fall out, but some of them I need to sort of scrape out with my finger. Definitely get rid of as many seeds as you can because they'll give your sauce a bitter taste. Then I'll just cut the peppers into smallish pieces. You could also just tear them, but some good kitchen scissors make quick work of it. Now I'm going to throw the peppers, onions, garlic, and tomatoes into my enamel Dutch oven. You can also just use a soup pot for this. Then I'll fill it up with water, enough to just about cover everything in the pot. Now to turn the heat on high and bring this all up to a boil. Once it's at a boil, I'll reduce the heat and let it simmer for 15 minutes. When the simmering is done, I'll use my big slotted spoon thingy and my big strainer pot to roughly separate the solids from the liquids. You can do this with a colander and a big bowl or something, but you definitely want to save that liquid you're straining out. Basically, we need some of the liquid in there, but not all of it. So I'm going to add about 1 cup of that liquid back into the solids, followed by the remaining ingredients, which are all my dry seasonings. And this is when one of those fancy high-powered blenders would come in super handy. But since I don't have one of those, I'm going to employ my trusty immersion blender and blend the hell out of everything, pretty much as smooth as I can get it. With this modest immersion blender, I'll go at it for a solid 2 or 3 minutes. Now I need to check my consistency and adjust as needed. I always start with less liquid than I'm sure I'll need, because I can always add more. But it's a big pain if I add too much and have to reduce it on the stove for a long time. I'll end up pouring in about another cup of that liquid and stirring it all in very well. The last thing I'm going to do is perhaps the most tedious step, and that's straining it through a sieve. You could look at this step as optional, but I really like my enchilada sauce to be as smooth as possible. So using a spoon and my funnel-shaped mesh strainer, I'll just run all of that mixture through until I'm left with a nice batch of super smooth sauce. I've also done this with a big mesh strainer bag, which is much faster, but also much messier. Either way, I want to squish and squeegee out as much of the liquid as I can, leaving behind those remaining solids. And when I'm all done, this is what I'm left with. About 3 pints of finished enchilada sauce, 2 cups of that original strained liquid, and this big clump of paste. And while my enchilada sauce is my intended end product today, there's no reason to waste that strained liquid or the paste because they are both absolutely full of flavor that I can use to enhance other recipes. For example, a spoonful of that chili paste in some amazing Spanish rice, or as a delicious seasoning when cooking taco meat. Now that the enchilada sauce is finished, it's time for the canning. And since I want to start this process with hot sauce, and it's cooled down quite a bit throughout the course of shooting this video, I'm just going to pour it all into a saucepan and heat it back up. And in the meantime, I'll get my jars heated up in the canner. I've just got them upside down in some water to basically steam them. The sterilization aspect of steaming them isn't exactly necessary, since official recommendations no longer require you to sterilize your jars before canning if the processing time will be longer than 10 minutes, but I do like starting with hot jars and hot food, so this will heat them up nicely. And on a related topic, they used to say you need to boil your lids. Now they say don't boil your lids because it could damage the seal, but it's still okay to heat them up in hot water, just not boiling, so I still do that. Now I'll transfer my pint jars over to the counter with my jar grabber tool, and using a canning funnel, I'll just start filling them up. For this, I need to leave 1 inch of headspace in each jar. So I'll use my headspace measuring tool to check, and I've definitely overfilled at least one of these jars, so I'll spoon out some of the sauce until I'm at that 1 inch mark. Next, I'll use the other end of that headspace measuring tool to debubble. That is, gently stir the contents of the jars, making sure to run it along the edges. This is just to dislodge any big air bubbles that might be down in there. With a very liquidy product like this, air bubbles shouldn't really be much of an issue. And then, using some damp paper towels, I'll thoroughly wipe the rims of each jar. I need to make sure to fully clean that top edge, wiping until I don't see any more sauce on the towel. Any remaining food or residue on this rim will obstruct the lid from perfectly seating onto the jar and can lead to a failed seal. Finally, it's time for the lids and rings. I'll set the lids in place and then twist those rings on, not super tight, just pretty snug. And now we're moving over to the pressure canner. For my model of pressure canner, I need to make sure there's 3 quarts of water in it. 3 quarts is pretty standard for a canner this size, but definitely make sure to check the instructions for your specific canner to be sure. It's probably impossible to see on camera, but there is an engraved 3-quart line on the inside of the canner, and I put a bit too much water in while I was steaming the jars earlier, so I'll remove some of it until I'm right at that 3-quart line. Now I will set the jars into the canner. Keep in mind that this water is still somewhat hot from when I was steaming the jars, so the jars are kinda hot, as are the jar contents, and they're going into kinda hot water. You want this temperature to be relatively consistent, because sticking glass jars into water that's a lot hotter or colder is a perfect recipe for broken jars. Now I'll put on the canner lid and make sure it's locked into place. I'm turning the stove to high heat, and I need to wait until the canner begins venting. That is, when a pretty consistent jet of steam starts shooting out of this little vent. The sound changes pretty abruptly when this happens, so it's easy to know when venting has begun. It goes from a bubbling, boiling sound to a steady hiss. It's hard to see on camera, but the canner is now venting. I need to let it continue venting for 10 minutes. Because pressure canning requires a pure steam environment, and venting uses heat and pressure to push out anything that isn't steam, namely air. After 10 minutes, I'll put on my pressure regulator. This type of canner uses this weighted topper to regulate pressure. Fancier models use a built-in dial and gauge, but for my weighted topper, I need 10 pounds of pressure, which is the topper plus 1 of the metal rings. If I needed 15 pounds of pressure, I'd use both metal rings, but I only need 1 for this. If you have a dial and gauge type of canner, set it to 11 pounds of pressure. And I always use tongs to put this topper in place because I was once reminded the hard way that there is indeed screaming hot steam shooting out of that vent, and I prefer to keep my fingers away from it. At this point, I need to do a little fine tuning. What I want is for that topper to start rocking pretty consistently back and forth. Not violently, not barely moving, but just a nice rhythmic rocking. On my stove, I have to dial the knob back to about 70%. Your stove will be different, so reduce that heat a little at a time until your topper looks and sounds something like this. And once the topper is rocking nice and consistently, the processing time has officially begun. For enchilada sauce in pint jars, we need to let it process for 50 minutes. So I'll set my timer and we'll pick it up when the processing is finished. Okay, 50 minutes is up. I've got my heat turned off And now I'll just leave this canner alone for a few minutes and let the pressure completely release. Don't mess with the topper, don't try to open the lid, just leave it alone. And once it completely stops making any sounds whatsoever, I'll remove that topper and I'm taking off the lid. Now I'll move the jars back over to the counter, setting them on a couple layers of towel. The jar contents will continue bubbling for a while, and that's normal. And over the next little while, I'll hear each of the lids pop, which is the sound of the pressure and temperature change sucking the lid inward and against the jar, thus signifying a successful sealing. Now I just have to leave the jars alone for several hours until they're completely down to room temperature. And as always, if any of my lids do not seal, that jar is not considered shelf stable and I have to make a decision. Put a new lid on it and try reprocessing, or just stick that jar in the fridge and use it in the next week or two. A failed seal doesn't happen often, but it happens sometimes and it happens to everyone. By the way, once the jars are completely cool, I like to give them a quick wash in the sink, just to clean off any sauce residue that may have seeped out of the jar during processing. Let them totally dry, and then my jars are ready to put up on the shelf, stored with the rings removed of course, and I'll have the most amazing homemade enchilada sauce to use whenever I want. And while I would often end my canning videos here, I would be remiss if I didn't go ahead and actually make some enchiladas with this sauce. I won't really go through every step because this is an enchilada sauce canning video and not an enchilada recipe video, but with some good sauce and some good filling, it's so easy to make absolutely mouth-watering enchiladas. Everyone has their own take on the proper method for making them, and this is how I do it. I've got a nice filling made from some chopped chicken, shredded white Mexican cheese, and just a bit of that sauce. Roll them up, lay them out, pour over a bunch of that sauce, smother with cheese, and bake. Finish with some chopped green onion, and you've got an enchilada so good, I guarantee you will keep eating well past the point of regretting your life choices. And once again, be sure to check out the video description for a link to the full recipe. And while you're at it, why not like and subscribe? It's free, easy, and you'll stay up to date on all our latest stuff, including future canning videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.